Hello and welcome, everybody. It's great to see all of you and some lovely faces from near and far. It is a real pleasure to be able to welcome Rabbi Johnny Solomon, who is going to be teaching us class 3 of Rabbi Sacks' spiritual biography. As you know by now, Rav Johnny is not just somebody who has a mastery of Rabbi Sacks's work, but in addition to that, he has an incredible teaching style and is a keen pedagogue. And we are the recipients of his hard work and his effort. It doesn't come out of a cloud and softly floats down on a silver platter. Rav Johnny puts in time, effort, and work in order to get the incredible presentation that he makes. And we are the fortunate recipients. And without any further ado, I am honored and pleased to hand over to Rav Johnny for today's third class. Rav Johnny.
Thank you, Rabbi Fishman. I'm going to share my screen as I do every time. I hope you can see this presentation. I want to just remind you where we are in our journey, and then we'll introduce our topic for today. So as Rabbi Fishman explained, this is a third of our 5-part series titled Rabbi Sacks' Spiritual Biography. And I've identified themes which weren't only topics which Rabbi Sacks addressed as a teacher, but also topics which shed light about him as an individual. And that, I think, is very, very interesting, because through learning his teachings, we gain a window, we gain a view into he himself, his life, his family, his journey. And so we began by talking about Rabbi Sacks on identity. We've since spoken about Rabbi Sacks on self-belief. And today we're going to talk about Rabbi Sacks on failure. So I want to stress that again. I want to talk about Rabbi Sacks, which, if you're on this call, if you're in this session, you likely think him to have been a great success, which he was. And I want us to focus on Rabbi Sacks on failure. And I want you to know it wasn't that hard to find teachings on failure in his writings. This, in fact, is a topic that interests him greatly. And you may say, why? And the answer is because this class is called Rabbi Sacks' Spiritual Biography. And the theme of failure spoke to him deeply. And as we're going to see, he encountered failure in many different ways in his life, notwithstanding encountering and achieving so many more successes. So just before I turn to our first slide, I want to give you a little timeline. I'm not going to write it out. It's not that important, but I want you to have a sense of Rabbi Sacks, especially in terms of his early career as a rabbi. He was actually born in 1948, which is a significant year, of course, for the modern Jewish period, the year when the state of Israel was established. But for our purposes, and we've spoken since about how he's in university and how he met the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and how he went to Kfar Chabad, and how he then subsequently studied elsewhere. But he achieved a rabbinic ordination, received smicha in 1976. So how old is he? Born 1948, received it 1976. He's 28 years old. And he's then appointed rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue, where I was just last week. And in fact, that was a synagogue where he worshipped in for the last few years of his life, and that's where I spoke to his wife and daughter just last week. So his first synagogue where he was the rabbi was a Golders Green Synagogue, and he was appointed to be the rabbi there in 1978, aged 30. Then, 4 years later, aged 34, he was appointed the chair in modern Jewish thought, actually the chief rabbi, Lord Jacobovitz's chair in modern Jewish thought, at a place called Jews College. If you've heard of Jews College, great. If you haven't, basically think of YU considerably smaller in lots of different ways, but Jews College was the YU, shall we say, of Anglo Jewry in lots of different ways that they're not the same, but a handful that are. But he is appointed the chair of modern Jewish thought in 1982, aged 34. By this point, he's had 4 years rabbinic experience, okay? He received his smicha 6 years before, and he's been a community rabbi for 4 years. Why is that important? Because in this position, working both as an academic and also working as a community rabbi, this is where he starts exploring ideas about the rabbinate. It's where he starts exploring ideas about the relationship between rabbinics and academia. So this period in his life, which many people don't know much about, is actually really important about the development of Rabbi Sacks. This is when he's studying from Rav Nachum Rabinovich, the great Maimonidean, and who became then the head of yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim, and his great mentor for the rest of his life. So let's now move to 1982, 1983. He is this chair of Jewish thought at Jews College. He's been a community rabbi for just 4 years. He's aged 34, 35, which means he's one of the youngest rabbis in Anglo Jewry. By that point, most people were not 20 when they're getting smicha and becoming a rabbi of a major shul. So he's amongst the youngest. Now, at that point, Jews College had a journal called Le'ela. And Rabbi Sacks wished to generate new excitement in Anglo Jewry. And now, having been a community rabbi for 4 or so years, he decides to introduce a column in Le'ela, which, in fact, he was the editor of this magazine. And so here is a copy. I actually have a photocopy of the original here, of his initial column, which talks about the rabbinate. He'd written a few other things as editor, but he says, starting with this issue, Le'ela will contain a regular feature called Response. The idea is to confront religious leaders in our community with a series of questions bearing on a subject of current concern, and then invite readers of Le'ela to respond. So this is a journal mostly being read by the more religious aspects of the community and significantly the rabbis of Anglo Jewry. And he's saying he wants to introduce a column where rabbis can talk about matters going on in synagogue and in rabbinic life. And he says, the first subject I'd like to choose is the rabbinate itself. What is it a rabbi supposed to do? Does it depend on the individual minister? Does it depend on their congregation? What should they talk about in the pulpit? What shouldn't they? You know, people were talking about those things then. Should the rabbi stay in a community for a short period of time or stay longer? What is the relationship between the rabbi and the layperson? And how about canonicals, which at the time in England, people were still wearing, you know, those formal garb that many rabbis were wearing since the Victorian period.
Rav Johnny, I'll interrupt you and just say that Congregation Shah HaShamayim is perhaps the only congregation in North America whose clergy still wear canonicals.
Excellent. Well, for those who wish to know Rabbi Sacks' thoughts about canonicals, I haven't got this piece here, but I have the paper literally on my desk. For those who wish to hear what he thinks about that, I'll gladly send it.
And another thing, if I can interject, Rabbi Nahum Rabinovich is from Montreal himself, and he was a disciple of Rabbi Hirschsprung before he
Wonderful. Yes, I of course I know who Rabbi Hirschsprung was, and I'm aware of him being a disciple. So it just shows this has all been planned from heaven, my friends. So here you have it, young Rabbi Sacks, aged 34, with about 4 and a bit years of pulpit experience, the editor of a kind of community/rabbinic journal, the chair of modern Jewish thought in Jews College, you know, under Rav Nachum Rabinovich. And he's encouraging rabbis in the community to basically bare their souls and share their thoughts in the next edition. Now, he did ask a few older rabbis to respond in this first article, which they do, and if you'd like to read them, you can. But you can see, and this is an abridged version of the article, at the end he says, how would you like to answer your questions? And he literally gives his address for them to submit their responses. And he's saying, next time, gosh, it's going to be such a great edition of all these rabbis of Anglo Jewry sharing their thoughts. We're going to have a deeper, meaningful conversation about the state of Anglo Jewry and the state of the rabbinate. Let me tell you what happens next time. The title of the article is called Zero Response. Now, you don't need to be a brain surgeon to figure out why it's called Zero Response. And he says at the top, he says, in the last issue of Le'ela, we printed a discussion about the rabbinate ended response. We invited participation from our readers and expressed the hope that this would become a regular feature of the magazine. The article that follows is an explanation of why the experiment has not been continued in this issue. And he says, and this is Rabbi Sacks writing, seemed like a good idea at the time, asked rabbis to talk about the rabbinate in public, and so we thought we would evoke a response. Who doesn't have strong ideas about his or her rabbi? When the sermon hits a 25-minute mark, you can always hear some right reflections about rabbinic eloquence. There are even some congregants for whom a special form of smicha should surely be devised, who can give their rabbi sermon for him before he's opened his mouth. The reaction when the odd errant minister discards his canonicals makes it seem as if he has discovered a new form of streaking. Congregations love rabbis the way Abraham loved his father's idols, and their relationship tends to proceed along similar lines. You can see he had a slightly cheekier tone in writing than you necessarily saw in his later things. So he says, so we sat back and waited. Science, zero, zilch. Was there anyone out there listening? Had our rabbis succeeded in sending their congregants to sleep even without their personal presence at a distance of many miles? Was a lack of response a gesture of reverence towards the reverends or reluctance to disagree in print with a man of the cloth? Now, Rabbi Sacks then spends the next 5 pages explaining why the things he wanted people to talk about are worthy to be spoken about, and his analysis is fascinating. But I'm bringing you this as a first kind of case study of our study on failure. Because if you're a 4.5-year, experienced pulpit rabbi, and you become the chair of Jewish thought and Jews College, and you say, everybody follow me, and no person follows you, zero, to the point you actually write an article titled Zero Response, I think we could argue that this experiment failed. This is the definition of failure. You try an idea and you say, please write to me at 31 Dunstan Road, and then you say, zero, zilch, silence. Anybody who thinks that Rabbi Sacks didn't experience failure didn't know him. In fact, as somebody who grew up in Anglo Jewry, there were ups, but there were also downs, and the community were aware of those downs, not him necessarily personally. We're not talking about a personal life. We're talking about here about professional life. He took many knocks, sometimes about the bold ideas he wished to share. As you may well know, he wrote a book that was banned, and he had to retract some lines, even though he didn't believe he needed to. But this is particularly poignant. I remember the first time I read it, I thought, whoa, that must have hurt. So if you're going to talk about failure and as a spiritual biography, then it needs to begin by recognizing that, especially as a younger rabbi, wishing to initiate certain conversations, not everybody responded, or to be very, very clear, nobody responded. So that should be a fairly clear demonstration that Rabbi Sacks was somewhat familiar with at least knockbacks, and to use that harsher term than necessarily we would like, but for our purposes, we'll use it anyway, failure. And when you realize this, and then when you know a little bit more about him, in actual fact, it makes sense why there are so many remarks about failure in all his books. It's not to say that this is a meta theme, but he talks about it a little bit more than you'd expect. In fact, less than a decade after having taken over as chief rabbi, he published one of his early books titled Celebrating Life. And in there, there's a chapter called Failure. Why? Because this is a topic that spoke to him. He wasn't just trying to empathize with others. This is written in 2000. He experienced that in 1982, 83. And between then and then, he had quite a few ups and a few knocks too. And so the topic of failure fascinated him because he realized that in order to succeed, you have to fall. And what he tried to teach us over the years is how to cope with falling. I don't think in 1982 and 83, he necessarily had the comprehensive vista in order to make sense of what was taking place in his life. But over time, he developed that vocabulary, he developed those ideas. And this is one of his early analyses of failure. And I want to read it from beginning to end. It's only 2 and a bit sides of this page. I remember reading this for the first time in 2000. In fact, I just wrote something on Facebook not long ago where I said, I remember not just reading it, but I was teaching in a school and a student of mine was going through a difficult time. And I read this essay with him and it made a big difference. So I've known this essay for 23 years. Let's read it together. And he says, it's one of my favorite stories, all the better for being true. A young chemist had been working for some time at developing a new bonding agent, a glue. Eventually the work was complete. He tried it out. It did not stick. What is the use of a glue that does not stick? A failure, time wasted, effort spent in vain. Back to the laboratory to try again. So 99 out of 100 people would surely have concluded. The young chemist was a 1 in 100 who thought differently. Instead of deciding his work was a failure, he asked, what if it's a success? What if I've discovered a solution? The only thing left to do is to find the problem. He refused to give up. He kept asking himself, what's the use of a glue that doesn't stick? Eventually he found it. It became a huge commercial success. I use it all the time. The non-sticking glue is used for notepaper you can attach and detach at will. That is how the Post-it pad was born. Did you know that? It was somebody who's trying to make a different glue that didn't work. And he realized he made a glue that worked so well for a problem that yet to be fully diagnosed. Rabbi Sacks explains, I think of that story every time I hear someone write off their own or other people's efforts as a failure. It's not just negative thinking, it is destructive of confidence, morale, self-respect. More importantly, it is not true, or at least it is not the best way of seeing things. Whenever colleagues or friends speak of failure, I tell them what it is like to watch a professional photographer at work. Usually they come to a portrait session armed with several rolls. I'm sorry, I'm just going to move this for a second, of film. They take 72 exposures in the hope that one will be right, unusual, dramatic, or one that just captures the character of the sitter. If it is, the session has been a success. Any observer who didn't understand professional photography might be justified in thinking that one usable outcome set against 71 rejects was on balance a failure. He would be wrong. He would simply not have understood the logic of creativity, whether artistic or scientific. Just think for a second, who is writing this? The same guy who, when asked all of the Anglo-Jewish rabbis to engage in a conversation, he got zero response. And that's just one example of many. Now, about 17, 18 years later, what has he done? He's developed a philosophy of failure. Creation by its very nature involves taking risks. The experiment that fails, the attempt that does not quite come off. Each is a part of the process that leads to discovery. Each is a learning experience. Analyzing why something fails is often one of the most instructive exercises one can undertake. Creativity without failure is like being lifted to the top of a mountain without the climb. It may be fun, but it is not an achievement. According to the effort, said the sages, is reward. Moreover, we are not, here and now, in a position to judge success. I think of Moses Maimonides, a great Jewish thinker of the Middle Ages. Rabbi Sacks was a Maimonidean. Rav Nachum Rabinovich was the world-class expert in Rambam. Late in life, he wrote a book. It was, he tells us, one of his letters, written for a single disciple who had doubts about his faith. It took a long time. Maimonides was in those days a physician, as well as the leader of his community, and the hours for writing were hard to find. Eventually, he completed it and sent it to the young man. From his reply, it is clear that it did not work. We often don't tell that part of the story. It didn't work. Perhaps he didn't understand it. At any rate, it did not answer this student's questions. It was a failure in Maimonides' lifetime. The name of the book was A Guide for the Perplexed, the greatest work of Jewish philosophy ever written. Continues Rabbi Sacks. I think too of the first Moses. What would his obituary, I'm sorry, I'm just moving this, have been like? Written by a contemporary. The evidence is there throughout the books that bear his name. When he intervened on behalf of the people, they complained. He had not made things better, he had made them worse. In Egypt, their burdens were made heavier. Leaving Egypt, they came up against the Red Sea. Crossing the sea, they found a desert. First, there was no water, and then there was no food. Then the people complained there was no meat. Having given the Israelites the 10 Commandments, Moses found that they had made a golden calf as an idol. Sending spies to prepare their entry into the land of Canaan, they came back and said it was impossible. Every effort Moses made to form a free and holy people collapsed. Nor was he privileged to set foot in the land in which he had spent 40 years traveling. Can a life of failures be a success? Continues Rabbi Sacks, sometimes it can be the greatest life there is. It took much effort, but eventually I learned that you have to make a blessing over failures too. How remarkable is this? You have here a great scholar who was now writing this towards the end of his first decade as chief rabbi. You can hear that this is an idea that he's developed. And as I mentioned before, you can see that it's come not just through academic study, but also life experience. We have some questions. Let's talk this through. Who would like to ask a question first?
Yes, I have a question about his zero response thing. I'm just wondering if he was just like a generation ahead of his time. If he'd done this in the age today of electronic communications, where you could just type something in a keyboard and directly send it, and where you can make corrections and stuff like that easily before you send it out, versus having to write in longhand or type or do something and then stick it in an envelope and send it to the post. I'm wondering if he would have gotten a lot more responses.
So obviously, you know, that question of what would happen if, you're probably right. However, I can list a number of other projects that I'm familiar with, which didn't require tremendous effort, which he suggested and didn't happen. He tried to create, by the way, a covenant across faiths to honor the Queen in her Jubilee. That didn't happen. Meaning there were a variety of things that he wished to do. He said he wished to do. He said it very publicly. And other people basically said, Rabbi Sacks, you're a great guy, but you're just dreaming. Now, he often spoke about being a dreamer. But what that means is when you're dreaming, you have ideas and you suggest them and people don't respond, you can sometimes feel that you've been either overlooked, you've been slighted, that you're a failure. And that's just, as I say, because it's written out so powerfully, you get the sense. But I agree in that case, but there were others too. What's clear, though, is this question of failure and how to turn something which is harsh or something which doesn't seem to work into something positive. Really, the example of the Post-it note is something that Rabbi Sacks developed. He was able to pivot from where things weren't perhaps ideal to taking that and saying, how can I better it? Any further thoughts about this short essay that I read? Okay. Now, if you want to see that this is something that very much interested Rabbi Sacks, Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg, a couple of years ago, actually more than a couple, about 3-4 years ago, interviewed Rabbi Sacks. He subsequently published this interview when Rabbi Sacks died. And among the questions Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg of Boca Raton Synagogue asked Rabbi Sacks was, and this was, remember, right towards the end of his life, he says, when we look at your life and productivity, where the trajectory is ascending to the chief rabbinate, publishing 30 books, it was actually more, 17 honorary degrees, being named a Lord, just seems that you've had success after success, triumph after triumph. Have you ever experienced failure? Now, if I hadn't shown you all that before, you'd think, that's a fair question. Now that I've explained what I've explained, you understand his response. By the way, he initially responded by saying, ha, just out loud. He says, have I ever experienced failure? My goodness me. Oh, and he laughs his head off as if it's a joke that Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg doesn't get. Because if you only know him as a successful global religious leader, you think everything was easy. But Rabbi Sacks knows his life. He knows about the zero responses. He knows about those propositions of the covenant. He knows about this thing he tried to do in the community and this project that didn't quite work. He says, I nearly failed my first year in my university. We know he's brilliant. There's failure. My first year in university, I nearly failed. I nearly failed my second year in university. I was turned down for virtually every job that I applied for. Since I was a kid, I wanted to write a book. I started when I was 20, and I gave it every minute of spare time that I had. He says, even when Elaine, his wife, and I went to a concert, I'd be writing notes during intervals between movements during a symphony. Yet I failed for 20 years. From 20 to 40, I had a huge file cabinet of books I started and never finished. And I want to pause here for a second, because part of this course, is to introduce you to dimensions of Rabbi Sacks you may not necessarily have been familiar with. The zero response Rabbi Sacks, this guy, the guy who's got all these books in a filing cabinet that hasn't published, the guy who applies for jobs and gets no, no, no. The guy who nearly fails the first 2 years of university, not because he's not smart, because he's doing other things. Still, he says, what changed is I happened to be reading the preface to Plays Unpleasant by George Bernard Shaw. It opens by saying that if you're going to write a book, write it by the time you're 40 or forget it. I thought it was min hashamayim, from heaven. Someone is telling me something because I had no idea what I happened to be reading that passage by that writer at that time. I thought to myself that it was my last chance. So I wrote my first book at 40, and then I wrote a book a year ever since, which is true. Until age 40, he didn't write a book. In fact, between 20 and 40, he thought he was a failure. And here, age 34, 35, he's trying to engage the Anglo-Jewish rabbinate, and everyone's just like, what are you talking about? Winston Churchill put it beautifully. Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. The secret was marrying someone who believes in you and then to just keep going, never stop. And I spoke about that line in our previous session titled Self-Belief. Now we get why Rabbi Sacks is so interested in failure. Because for a significant amount of his life, he thought he wasn't a success. He was frustrated. In fact, don't you think that from age 40, everything was plain sailing, but all of a sudden things start to be moving? Knowing this helps you understand why there's a whole essay in Celebrating Life titled Failure. And in almost every other book, you'll see from all the quotes I'm about to quote, they're from many different books. This is a topic that he turned to because it spoke to him, because he'd experienced it. And so whenever he talks about failure, he's not talking about it from an objective, distant standpoint. He's talking about it from a very subjective, personal experience. He remembers what happened to him. He remembers feeling rejected when he applied for jobs and the answer was no. He remembers that zero response. And what does he say? And that was the making of him. He developed a theology based on those so-called failures. Now, let's go and read a couple of these quotes. So what I've basically done now is collate a number of quotes from Rabbi Sacks's teachings and writings about failure. He says here in Covenant Conversation, Genesis, these are his essays on the Chumash. Each of us knows from personal experience that events that seem disappointing, painful, and even humiliating at that time can be the most important in our lives. Through them, we learned how to try harder next time, or they taught us a truth about ourselves, or they shifted our life into a new, more fruitful direction. We learn not from our successes, but from our failures. We mature and grow strong and become more understanding and forgiving through the mistakes we make. A protected life, one where we avoid mistakes, is a fragile and superficial life. We hadn't read the Zero Response. If you hadn't heard that interview with Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg, you'd say, well, he's just philosophizing. This is autobiographical. He's talking about himself. He's telling you his journey. He's telling you his story. The word humiliating, certainly that would have been when you suggest that everybody responds and nobody does, and you end a project right at its beginning. But as he says, what does that tell me to do? Try harder. Come up with clever ways of doing things, a new fruitful direction. You can basically write a midrash on this text based on the life of Rabbi Sacks. And so Rabbi Sacks over time became more and more prepared to take risks, not because he thought they would work, but he knew whatever would happen, he'd learn from them and likely be able to achieve something good as a result. Any quick thoughts about this quote? Now you can see he says very similar things elsewhere. This isn't in Covenant Conversation, this is Lessons in Leadership. Again, essays on the Chumash, but these are ones from a series about being a leader. The great human beings are not those who never fail. They're those who survive failure, who keep on going, who refuse to be defeated, who never give up or give in. They keep trying. They learn from every mistake. They treat failure as a learning experience. From every refusal to be defeated, they become stronger, wiser, more determined. It is this just an interesting idea about failure, or is this autobiography? He may well say, I wouldn't refer to myself as being a great human being. That may be the case. But ultimately, he's speaking about leaders. And ultimately, he's writing this. And ultimately, this is very personal to him. He treated failure as a learning experience. And so every time he suggested something that didn't work, he said, well, I need to learn something more. That's how you become smart. Not just from succeeding all the time, but by actually making mistakes and growing. Our sages teach this, right? 7 times a righteous person falls and they get up. A person needs to try, they'll fall, they need to learn to get up. And that resilience, that determination, that is what makes you great. Greatness is not the success you have, but instead greatness is even when you get knocked down, you put in the effort, the energy to get up once again. Rabbi Sacks did this time after time. The very fact that he was as great as he was, especially towards the end of his career, is precisely because when I was young, he didn't have it easy. The press would often criticize him for being too modern or being too liberal or being too conservative. He would get it from the right and from the left. He was too academic for the average person. He was whatever. So what did he do? He kept on. He learned, he refined, he polished things. Every single one of his books, I have all of his books. It's as if, you know, the rabbis talk about a wine that ages and gets better. You can see that with his writing, the sophistication. This is somebody who learns how to do things better and better and better. He goes on and he says, in a different book, Judaism's Life-Changing Ideas, can you see? He's touching on this topic everywhere. Even the greatest human beings made mistakes, failed as often as they succeeded, and had moments of black despair. What made them great was not that they were perfect, but they kept on going. They learned from every error, refused to give up hope, and eventually acquired a great gift that only failure can grant, namely humility. They understood that life is about falling 100 times, not just 7, and getting up again. It is about never losing your ideals, even when you know how hard it is to change the world. It's about getting up every morning and walking one more day towards a promised land, even though you know you may never get there, but knowing also that you helped others get. Who is he talking about? Obviously Moses towards the end. But ultimately he's talking about himself. He's talking about Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He's talking about the community that he built. Even if it took some scrapes and efforts, even if people sometimes turned against him, even though he was trying super hard. This is autobiographical, and it's all over the place. And once you know about him, then you realize that he's whispering in your ear in these words. I went through this. And trust me when I'm saying this, because it's based on not just reading books. It's getting knocked in the university of life. Anybody got any thoughts now? We've looked already through 3 similar quotes from 3 different books, in addition to the essay from Celebrating Life. You can see that this is a topic that spoke deeply to Rabbi Sacks.
Rabbi, I think a wonderful example of a leader having known failure would be Winston Churchill, who after his wonderful success and victory in the war, lost the next election and came back and thereafter won an election.
You're absolutely right, Rita, which is why, who does he quote over here? Winston Churchill. Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. In fact, this is one of his favorite quotes on the topic. So you're right. So you can see this is something which he did a lot of thinking about and something which he often had to turn to. He had to develop a thicker skin, but he also had to develop an idea that I'll grow from the challenges I experience, and even the projects I don't get to do, the books I don't get to write, the opportunities that I think could have been done but were dashed. I'll be able to learn from there how to do things better. So Rabbi Sacks wasn't a robotic, automated leader. He was a thoughtful leader, constantly asking questions, constantly pushing, constantly looking forward. He was an innovative leader. And when you're an innovator, sometimes, yes, as mentioned before, you're ahead of your time. So what do you do with that when people aren't with you? You try, you encourage them, you work collaboratively, but sometimes you can't convince them. Do you give up hope? Well, perhaps you could do. But Rabbi Sacks realized that would be a bad thing for him. He realizes that's not the right lesson that we learn from the Torah. All of the great leaders are people who suffered, who struggled, who had failures, and they got up. And that's what he did. In response to Sharon, yes, of course, all of these handouts are yours for you to use. So we'll be sending them through. Any quick thoughts? I can see, David, you want to say something? Anybody else?
Yes, it's a well-known axiom in the technology business that failure is not to be frowned upon. Success, there's so many examples of successful people who were failures earlier. And indeed, sometimes you have to fail because it's not just business that you're failing at. Also, you've got technology, new technology you're trying to try, which is also prone to failure. And so it's very unstable. And the most successful people have had failures before, a number of failures. Right.
In fact, just for you to know that this, again, he discusses in every single book. And in Celebrating Life, he talks about the Post-it notes, but later on, he talks about technology, failures that led to successes. I mean, this is part and parcel of his canon, shall we say. Now, this is where he distills these ideas further. We haven't yet quoted from Studies in Spirituality, another book where he talks about it. Again, the feeling of failure does not necessarily mean that you have failed. Or it means you have not yet succeeded. Still less does it mean that you are a failure. To the contrary, failure comes to those who take risks. And the willingness to take risks is absolutely necessary if you seek, in however small a way, to change the world for the better. Who is he talking about? He's talking about many people. He's talking about many of the people who are his role models, his heroes. He often spoke about technology leaders who stumbled towards success. But he's also, in a humble sort of way, in a veiled sort of way, speaking about himself. You can see this. You don't talk about the topic every single book, and it not be one that speaks deeply. We've spoken about identity, we talk about self-belief. But failure comes up a lot. The Power of Ideas, another book. This one was published posthumously, a collection of essays of his. And these were published much more in the general press, personally not the Jewish press, but the British press or elsewhere. Success does not mean a life without failure. To the contrary, almost all the great figures in any field, arts, the sciences, business, and certainly the religious life, had more than their share of disasters. What marked them out was first their willingness to take risks, to experiment, and secondly, their ability to learn from failure rather than be defeated by it. He's talking about himself. He's talking about many other people too. He took risks. He took so many risks. Many of the ideas we now take for granted as being these Rabbi Sacksisms, these are risks. A lot of people thought they were deeply controversial, problematic. To talk about God, talk about personal God for Anglo Jewry was very much out of sync with where the community was. To start talking about other faiths, which is what he did, especially in the Dignity of Difference, was completely out there. To suggest that religion and science can not just reconcile, but are great partners, right? That was something which most rabbis, they had this mantra that there was a religion and science disagreement. Rabbi Sacks says, I beg to disagree. Many of the community felt the Jews should keep themselves. What did Rabbi Sacks do? The BBC would offer him opportunity to do documentaries before Rosh Hashanah every year, and he'd be mixing with lots of other people. Many people said, don't ever talk with atheists. So what does Rabbi Sacks do? He has 2 debates with Richard Dawkins. Every single one of these led criticism towards him. They happened. But as a result of taking those risks, and sometimes, by the way, making mistakes therein, he changed the landscape, not just of Anglo Jewry, but world Jewry. He was a discoverer. He took those risks. He did experiment. He learned from those failures. And I wouldn't be sitting here had he not tried those things. This shelf of his books over here wouldn't be there had he not tried for 20 years to write a book and felt like he was a loser. And then he starts. He wouldn't have been the chief rabbi that he was had he not thoughtfully thought about what it means to be a rabbi and shared some ideas, and then got 0 response. And in so doing, he realized actually that community rabbis were not prepared to necessarily talk about some of their ups and downs in public. So what did he do? He'd make sure to put more time in personal mentoring, which he was to all the Anglo-Jewish rabbis. So all of these things became the making of this great leader. This is our final quote. And Rabbi Sacks, quoting a Gemara from Bachot, says the following: when we grow through our failures, we become greater than those who never fail. The Gemara says, where the penitents stand, even the perfectly righteous ones cannot stand. Meaning, who is greater, somebody who was always perfect, or somebody who failed and learned from their mistakes and grew? According to our sages, the latter. And he says that's not just a minor rabbinic remark. That's a statement about the human condition. When we grow through our failures, we become greater than those who never failed. This comes from a different book, Ceremony and Celebration. And by the way, there were 4, 5, 6 other quotes I could have brought you from all the others. Rabbi Sacks was fascinated by failure because there were moments in his life that he thought he was. And he realized that what made him a success is because he got up from those failures. He learned from those mistakes. To truly be a wise person is not to make mistakes, but to learn from them. And that he did. So this is Rabbi Sacks. The Rabbi Sacks we often think about is the rabbi who wrote in total over 40 books. The real Rabbi Sacks was a guy who said, come on, Chevra, let's start a conversation. He gets 0 response. The real Rabbi Sacks is somebody who was constantly saying, am I doing right? Or should I listen to the critics? Who's always thinking about failure, who's thinking about the analogy of a photographer. Why? Because when it comes down to it, most of those photographs are not the ones that go on the mantelpiece. But as he processes these ideas, he realizes this became the making of others, and this will become the making of him. He almost fails at his degree. He is rejected from these jobs. He writes these books, and they're not ever published. But then something happens. And something happens is others believe in him. Elaine, other mentors, Rav Nachman Rabinovich. And he continues to make mistakes, as every human being does. But he starts seeing it from a different perspective. He's able to write that essay we previously saw. And then in almost every single book since then, there's a piece, there's a line, exploring failure. Because he knows that he became great because he went through that. And because he's wishing to tell each of us that we become great because we go through this. I previously said that that essay that published in the year 2000 was one that I shared with a student. But in actual fact, I'd read it myself. Why? Because there was a point in my life where I thought, oh, I've also failed. I didn't do great in my degree. I'm not going to do well. And I read that essay and I thought, maybe there's another way of looking at life. It gave me chizuk. And I passed that forward and it gave me my student chizuk. And so I'm passing this forward to you because I believe that there's wisdom in the teachings of Rabbi Sacks that can bring clarity and comfort and healing. That's what I try and do through the other work that I do as a spiritual coach. But even in this conversation, hearing these words, I think each of us are moved by, are touched by the way in which Rabbi Sacks revisits this topic, because he knows that people need to hear it, because he knows there was a point when he needed to hear it. So perhaps it may seem strange that somebody so successful constantly talks about failure. His message is, if you want to know about me, you really want to know me, if you want to do something about my spiritual biography, know something about my relationship with failure. We were best buddies. And know that I then took that. I seized that sense of frustration and I used it to push me forward. Those projects I proposed, though didn't work, I learned about how to come up with better projects. Those books I didn't write, well, that helped me write the books that you now know and perhaps on your shelves. So failure is part and parcel of the Rabbi Sacks spiritual biography, not because he was a failure, because his success at learning from the ups and downs of life. He paid attention. All of us make mistakes. The question is, are we wise enough to pay attention? And certainly he was, and hopefully, if we can take something from today's session, we will be as well. So those are my thoughts on the subject. I'm happy to hear your thoughts.
I have a question, Rabbi. I've been reading Rabbi Sacks's books, especially in the last year, and I appreciated your commentary today. Terrific. Has anyone distilled for young people, children or adolescents, some of these principles from Rabbi Sacks's teaching about failure? Because I had a conversation with my daughter this week, where she's like, where she had to face a moment where she hadn't succeeded, and she said, "But Mom, that you've never experienced this, and Grandpa, he's never experienced this." And I said, "Livy, of course, experienced failure." And I told her about some of my very accomplished father's greatest failures, which actually was a great comfort to her because he's a very successful individual, and some of my own. So I just wondered if anyone has done that and how that's it.
So the short answer is yes, and I don't want to point the finger at me, but me. Basically 10 years ago, I started teaching the thought of Rabbi Sacks. That led me to transcribe and collate quotes from all of his books and then organize them by subject. That's available on his website, or I can send you this booklet of 1,800 quotes arranged by topic, including an entry on failure. So I've done that. All of these quotes, apart from the extra few from these articles that were perhaps less familiar, they exist and they're available on the Rabbi Sacks website, or I can send you a PDF of this about 100-page document with all those quotes arranged by subject, which I did. But by the way, I did this as I was teaching. And when I did that, I gifted it back to Rabbi Sacks. I said, "You've taught us so much. Here are your ideas in ways that younger people who may not necessarily be reading all your books can learn and appreciate." So if you ever see quotes around, it's probably because I typed them.
It's a question.
Sure.
I've seen Rabbi Sacks in person 2-3 times. And what you're saying is so opposite of how he appears, how he speaks. There's no touch of failure in the way he was confident, erudite. He spoke, he touched people's hearts. So how did he overcome or hide this obviously from his writing? You said he failed many times, but he kept going. He didn't seem like that. It just didn't seem that way.
Okay, so firstly, I appreciate the question, and I don't think necessarily things are binary. You can be being successful and still fail. You know, a person can have a job, they can apply for a promotion, they don't get it, they still seem to be doing quite well. Okay, so the word failure is not the totality of a person, it's vis-a-vis individual projects and propositions, such as the ones we saw. That's important to say. So I'm not, you know, by no means kind of saying Rabbi Sacks was a failure. I'm saying he felt that he suffered failures in certain projects he wished to achieve that didn't work out. And I could miss you some, and these are probably just the tip of the iceberg. I was speaking to his wife just last Shabbat. She could probably say, if I'd say to her, did your husband ever feel that he failed in certain things? She'd probably say, you know, how much time have you got? So the question then is, how did that align with the persona? Well, first and foremost, and I'm a teeny bit similar, but that's the only reason I'm comparing that. He and perhaps Ivan Moore was actually more of an introvert, but in actual fact, as a speaker, as a teacher, he was very energetic, very engaging. But that was counterbalanced by spending time at home and studying, right? Locking himself in basically the garden shed for every summer for pretty much 30 years to write a book a year. So there are aspects of a personality that we see and aspects that we don't see. So the energetic, bold, successful person, of course he was in so many ways, but it's precisely because we weren't in his kitchen, you know, on a Thursday 11 when somebody sent him an email saying that idea you want is not going to happen. That too was part of him. And that's not to take away, that's for us to understand. That's why on Friday morning he came up with a better idea. But those Thursday night frustrations or Tuesday morning meetings that didn't go his way, those times when he said, guys, I have an idea and it didn't happen, those also happened time after time. Some privately, and also, truth be told, in Anglo Jewry, some very publicly. Some of his supporters kind of walked away from him. They felt that he should have done more about certain things. If you read some of the biographies written about him, there are areas where he's strongly criticized and he had to deal with that. There were mistakes he made. There was a very, very public one about writing to somebody about something which then very much offended another, which was really, really a big political, almost scandal in the community. So firstly, there are things that are recorded, some less so. But the fact that when you met him, perhaps when he was giving a talk in a synagogue, he seemed like he was a bundle of energy, which he would have been with a big smile and a yellow tie, does not negate these other dimensions of him, which is exactly why I'm giving this course. Because I suspect if anybody's clicked on YouTube, you've seen that part of him. I want you to know the other part, and I'm not trying to, by any which means, diminish our understanding of Rabbi Sacks, but he'll be the first to say, if you tell my life story, tell it warts and all. He would be annoyed if we try and portray him as being, you know, a person where everything went right, because as he said, it didn't, and that's why I became what I became. So I think it actually behooves us to be true to his narrative and his life journey by at least sharing the things about him which were in the public domain, such as that article and such as that interview. These are not things that I'm not sharing anything inappropriately private, but this is him too. If you want to know him, this is why we're learning together. And as Rabbi Fishman said, I put a bit of time into putting these materials together and to give a better, more holistic perspective of who Rabbi Sacks was. I think it helps us better understand his drive, better understand how come he was able to pull off so many great things. The answer is because it wasn't the first version. It wasn't try number one. Like all creatives, it took quite a few tries.
I have a question, comment, I guess.
Sure.
Just because in one of the quotations, it says something about the feeling of failure. Like you have the feeling of failure, but perhaps people on the outside, those on the looking at you, may say, that person's not a failure, but you still have that feeling that you're a failure. There's Hey,
yeah,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's very astute for you to notice. That's exactly what he's saying. At that point where he's writing that, you know, he's a guy with multiple degrees, written already quite a few books. Right. But in that moment, he's feeling that feeling, and that's an authentic feeling of him.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous actor, Robin, you know, the one who committed suicide.
Robin Williams.
Robin, and he, I think that was one of the things that he says towards the end, that he didn't still, despite all his successes, he still didn't feel successful. You know, so.
Right. And just by the way, Rabbi Sacks himself speaks about Robin Williams on a couple of occasions. He was very interested in creatives. He wasn't a musician, he wasn't an artist, but he was a very creative person. And so the power of creativity fascinated him. And that feeling of both being connected and achieving is a big deal. And let's not forget, one of his great spiritual mentors is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, whose most famous book is called The Lonely Man of Faith. We think of him as being this great success, but as he himself said, as many others too, he was very, very lonely, both in terms of intellectual loneliness, spiritual loneliness on occasion. So you can be Rav Soloveitchik and feel lonely. You can be a Rabbi Sacks and feel like a success. One does not contradict the other. It's often only when you take a moment to consider these issues deeply, you realize, yeah, actually, I can imagine how that pushed him forward. And we talked about that last week in self-belief. We even mentioned loneliness, do you remember? So that was part and parcel of his identity periods in history, and certainly with the Rav too. We probably got time for maybe one more question.
Can you hear me?
Sure.
I'm a little reluctant perhaps to ask this question because I don't want to I feel I don't want to enter into something that may be too personal, but what was his relation with depression? He did say after his father passed away that he fell into a depressed period. And this talk about failure and the attitude toward failure and success doesn't seem like he was suffered from depression, but do you have any insight into that?
We touched one of the quotes we read last week. His words very much suggest that. There's another quote which I can share with you where not only does he say that explicitly about after the death of his father, they took him 2 years to get out of a feeling of depression, even though he knew his father was sick, meaning it wasn't coming out of the ordinary. And I can tell you one further thing. I mean, again, this is public knowledge. Nothing am I saying is untoward. When he died, one of the rabbis of the United Synagogue who worked for him, meaning one of his, shall we say, flock where he was a shepherd, he says, when in that 2-year period where Rabbi Sacks was really overcome after the death of his father, and he says he made a lot of mistakes in those 2 years, Rabbi Sacks himself attests to that. So this rabbi said to me, I was called in to basically, I wouldn't say cheer him up in a flippant way. He says, I was called in to go in and give him a pep talk. And imagine that. Somebody's called in to give rabbi, because sometimes you need that. Every rabbi needs a rabbi, which is why in his latter books, for example, Morality has a whole chapter criticizing the field of self-help. Because he said, actually, and this is something that he touches on a number of occasions, we can't help ourselves when we're in a dark time. We need other people. So he speaks about things different ways. I don't want to, speak more than I know about him. I wasn't his confidant. That would be inappropriate for me to claim that in any which way, but I've read all he's written and I've studied it with great depth and spoken to lots of other people. And it very much seems to be that portrait. And he himself believes that you need other people to help you get out of things. And that's what happened with him. So, of course, if there's any more on that particular topic, I'm more than happy to share that. I'm just thinking, just for you to know, Rabbi Fishman, that chiefly quotes, I think that might be there's a newer version. So if you want, I'll send you a newer version, because there was 1 or 2 books that were published since then.
And did you also say that you had please do. And did you also say that you had put together a series of quotes just on failure?
Well, within the chiefly quotes, it's all categorized by subject within there.
Okay, that's what you were referencing.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, if you could send me that.
With pleasure. I'll send you the updated version because there's an extra one. Things like the power of ideas were in the.
Okay, great. And then I'll share the PDFs with the students for next week. Thank you so much, Rav Johnny.
Pleasure.
I have the feeling that it's almost cruel to cut off this class now because people, I think, want to keep asking questions and are like hanging off your every word. Thank you so much. I think the reason this touches us all so deeply is because it is so human to make mistakes. And in Rabbi Sacks's works, we read into our own lives as we're hearing his personal anecdotes. And I find that is what makes, for me personally, his words so encouraging, because it is taken to heart so powerfully. I think of my own mistakes, and then I see him speaking about how we can propel ourselves forward from them. It becomes so incredible. I'll finish with an anecdote that you didn't get to, although I know for a fact that you must know this story. Rabbi Sacks wrote his PhD on mutual responsibility in halacha. And he spoke about the concept of tochacha. When another Jew is doing something wrong, what should be the approach in terms of how we relate to them, how we correct them, how we love them. And it was the Lubavitcher Rebbe who had encouraged him to go back to university to finish that PhD. And upon completing it, he sent the transcript of the final copy to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe read the PhD transcript, and in handwritten notes, he wrote at the end, but what about chapter 32 of the Tanya? Why didn't you include it? And Rabbi Sacks later would say, and I forget the reference of what he was referencing, that X, it skips my mind now, maybe Rav Johnny, you know, that X was his attempt at presenting chapter 32 of the Tanya, even though he had unfortunately skipped it. I don't know if that counts as another mistake, another failure, but he said as a way of correcting that omission, he had dedicated himself to doing X. Unfortunately, I don't remember what that X was. Do you recall offhand, Rav Johnny?
I don't know, but his first book is Torah Studies, the summary of the Sichot.
Maybe that was it. Maybe that was it. Wow, I feel so inspired. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I can't wait for next week.
Right, next week we're talking about joy, and we'll be talking a little bit more about his relationship with his wife. I said that we would do.
Okay,
so
good.
That's what we'll be doing then.
So we have 7 days to walk around miserable, thinking of our failures, until next week we talk about joy, and that will pick us back up again. Rav Johnny, thank you so much. Yesha Koach. Beautiful.
Be well, everybody. Take care. Have a great week.
Bye, everyone. Be well. Great to see everyone's faces.
Thank you.